When it comes to places where children can thrive and succeed, the best state in the country is Massachusetts. That's the newest ranking from child advocates at the Annie E. Casey Foundation in their annual survey known as Kids Count. Among the main factors in the ranking are poverty rates, school performance, and access to health insurance. State officials say the ranking shows public intervention can be effective, but they also note many families in Massachusetts continue to struggle with the cost of living. To discuss the ranking, we'd like to welcome two guests, the Senior Associate from the Casey Foundation, Jann Jackson, and the Executive Director of the Massachusetts Law Reform Institute, Georgia Katsoulomitis. Thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you, Chris, for having us.
Thank you, Chris.
I want to start with Jann about number one. What is so good?
Well, for the last 25 years, the Annie E. Casey Foundation has been looking at broad measures of child well-being. As you mentioned, we're looking at 16 indicators in the domains of economic well-being, health, education, and family and community. We get the numbers from the census and from vital statistics because that allows us to compare state to state. So this release is happening all across the country today. When we look at how Massachusetts is doing on those 16 indicators and we pull it all together, Massachusetts has a lot to celebrate. That you're doing better. Kids have a greater chance of thriving here in Massachusetts than in any other state. So there's a lot to celebrate, and there's a story about why you're doing so well, and my colleague here will talk about some of that. It also means there's a long way to go, and the numbers say yes, there's much to celebrate. For example, only 1% of your children are uninsured. That's a lot to celebrate. But then when we look at reading, we've got far too many fourth graders who still aren't reading proficiently.
Georgia, what about the story?
Well, first of all, I want to say that this is good news for the Commonwealth. It's always great to be number one relative to other states in the country. But as Jann noted, there is still a long way to go. And from our perspective, and Mass Law Reform is the statewide poverty law and policy center, from our perspective, a 15% poverty rate in Massachusetts is unacceptable. It has been unchanged for the last couple of years, and in fact, we are seeing deeper concentrations of poverty, particularly in certain areas and certain neighborhoods around the state. For example, you know, the 15% average poverty rate doesn't really tell the story of what's going on in many communities around Massachusetts. When you look at a community like Roxbury, for example, that we're looking at a 46% child poverty rate. When you look at some of the gateway cities, we're looking at 26 to 30% poverty rates. So the 15%, it's really an average, but there are deep concentrated pockets of poverty around the state. And unfortunately, children of color in the Commonwealth, African American and Latino children, are disproportionately affected by poverty. So even though this is a day to celebrate good news, it's also a day to reflect on the fact that we still have a long way to go. And in terms of why we are number one, because we made investments in education and in healthcare that really have reaped benefits for our children. And that's really the story here, is that we need to be willing to invest in programs and services that we know work, such as education and healthcare. Now, affordable housing is a very critical issue in Massachusetts. Access to affordable child care. Access to transportation for low-income parents, skills development so that families can have 21st century skills and get well-paying jobs. This is all part of addressing child poverty and poverty in general.
Jen, you've seen the other states in the country, and I'm sure you see places where there isn't much going on as far as an economy to support things.
Right.
We have an advantage in that way in Massachusetts. So is this just trickle down from a healthy economy, or does it take a lot more than that?
It takes a lot more than that, and that's what really is the good news about Massachusetts. As Georgia mentioned, the fact that kids are doing well or poorly is not just a random event. We know a lot about what kids need to thrive. They need to be born healthy. They need to have high quality early care and education. They need to enter school ready to learn, read proficiently, know math, graduate, have a skill, stay out of trouble. We know the benchmarks for healthy child development. We know how to do it. We know that when we make public policy and public investments for all kids to have those things, kids are very resilient and they can do well and they can overcome considerable odds. So it's a matter of public knowledge that we have, but public will is needed to make sure that we do what works and that we make that available for all kids. Right now in America, we're finding that there's an erosion of the belief in our ability to come together and solve social problems. There's a belief that there's a lot of people vilifying poor people or reacting with fear with the growing diversity in this country. America is great when we come together and solve social problems together, and then we realize that it's part of our responsibility as adults to make sure the next generation has at least as many of the benefits that we have had, as well as more.
Georgia, we hear a lot of individual success stories, somebody from public housing, somebody who's an immigrant and a valedictorian, but get beyond those individuals to what you're talking about with concentration of poverty. If you live in an area with concentrated poverty, how does that set you back?
Oh, place is very important in terms of child development. Where you grow up is critically important. If you grow up in a neighborhood where there's high violence, there's a lot of crime, there's crumbling schools, there's no opportunity for any kind of advancement. If your parents or parent has a difficult time procuring employment in that neighborhood, everything in a child's environment affects his or her development. It affects his or her development, his or her mental or physical health, and ultimately their long-term ability to succeed. So if a child is in an environment where they are surrounded by poverty, surrounded by crime, in a school system that isn't really serving them well, in overcrowded schools, ultimately that's going to have an effect on them. So as we talk about public investments, and yes, the reason why Massachusetts is #1 is because we have had the political will and we have made investments, and I will add to that that we have come together cross-sector. The government, the nonprofit sector, the business community, we've all been serious about education, healthcare. We need to do the same thing with other issues, but we cannot I think a large part of structural and intergenerational poverty is really tied into where a child grows up. And I would add on top of that that, focusing on the community is very important, but also focusing on the parents. I mean, that's something that gets lost in the debate, that when we invest in children, we by necessity also need to invest in their parents. We need to make sure that their parents have the opportunity to access a well-paying job. We have to make sure that their parents have the ability to accumulate wealth and develop assets. We have to make sure that their parents have access to programs that provide them and their families with basic human needs, so the protection of the safety net is critically important, and that's been eroded over the last 20 or so years, and we have seen a consequential rise in poverty and also in child poverty because of that. So many factors go into raising a healthy, vibrant child that's ready to learn and ready to succeed. There's no silver bullet. There's multiple systems and multiple players that have to come together to make that work.
Jann, the other part of this is you're asking many people when they're voters to think in terms of, well, do I pay for investing in other people's children, if not my own? Right.
And one of the things, again, that's made this country great is the willingness of prior generations to pay it forward. So if we look at, the revenue that we pool together, which is called our state budget, there's economies of scale. If I were to pay for police protection out of my pocket, it would take my entire paycheck. But for relatively small amounts, if we pool our resources, suddenly there's a police officer on the end of the telephone call if somebody's breaking into my house. If I were to pay for education out of pocket, it would cost my entire paycheck. But we have a system called public schools. So our history has been built upon the principles that when we come together with collective resources, with collective will, public institutions, everyone can benefit. Education's been the great equalizer. It's enabled America to bring different immigrant populations into this country and mold a single people that are able to participate in the democratic process. So we say at Casey, there aren't any other people's children. There's just the next generation. Are they going to be prepared or not? The next generation is going to face some of the most complex challenges of any generation in human history. Think about it, climate change, globalization, everything that's going on in the world. We need to give this generation the very best if they are going to not only survive, but be able to tackle the challenges that come ahead. There are no other people's children. There's just our children.
Judy, I want to ask you about the measure of poverty being used in the survey. If you compare Massachusetts to the rest of the country, especially places like West Virginia or Mississippi, we think we're doing pretty good because the numbers are low. But Georgia, how low does that mean to you?
You mean how low should the
in
poverty
other words, if the number's relatively low, but you know, what do you read into that about the way things are in Massachusetts?
I still think 1 out of 7 children in Massachusetts is too high, given that our economy compared to other states is actually doing pretty well. I mean, overall, as a Commonwealth, we are doing pretty well economically. So the fact that we still have 15% of our children living in poverty, I don't think that bodes well for the state. I think it could have been a lot worse if certain investments hadn't been made, but I still think we have a very long way to go. And I think I'm going to piggyback on something that Jann said, and then also answering your question. It's not about other people's children. These are our children. And it is in our self-interest as a Commonwealth to make sure that we provide all children in the Commonwealth every opportunity to succeed. I mean, let's really think about this long term. If we're saying that 1 out of every 7 children in Massachusetts is growing up in poverty today, we know, I mean, there's been numerous studies that have shown that children that grow up in poverty have very, very poor life outcomes. They either end up in the juvenile justice system, they themselves end up in poverty, they end up with very poor health or mental health outcomes. They end up unemployed or underemployed. So if we accept that 1 in 7 is an okay number, we're basically saying that we accept that in 20 years, 1 in 7 people in our workforce will be ill-equipped to compete in the state. So it really is for the economic well-being of the state that we make serious investments in children and families and communities that are currently living in poverty and lift them out.
Jann, is there any indicator which Massachusetts is weak?
I think that one of the areas that takes us all by surprise is in the area of education, where you're number 1. And you look at the number of 4th graders not reading proficiently based at the NAEP, which is the standardized test. To say that 53% of your 4th graders are not reading proficiently based on this test is pretty alarming, because up until the age of 9 or up until the 4th grade, the child is learning to read, but after the 4th grade, children are reading to learn. And what we find is when kids can't meet that milestone, they start to become disengaged, they start having trouble in school, acting out, suspension, expulsion, all the rest. So to be number 1 and still have that kind of you know, serious need to focus, it just lets you know how poorly kids in other states are doing. But also, I think, sounds the alarm of we're great compared to many states, but there's still really important work that we can do and we know how to do it. That's the good news.
Thank you both very much, Jann Jackson and Georgia Katsoulomitis.
Thank you very much.